This is Outlander Science Club, brought to you by Desiree Andrews, midwife, and Karen Daugherty, emergency physician. Claire loves science, and so do we. Come with us as we investigate the science and medicine from the worlds of Outlander.
Hello, everyone. This is Karen, and I am bringing you this week's episode of Outlander Science Club. And this one may leave you with the heebie-jeebies and feeling kind of itchy because we are talking about a particular tropical disease today. So in chapter 60, we have Claire visiting Rose Hall, and she is introduced to some patients that need her help. And one in particular is a young man lying in the corner of a kitchen pantry, but he doesn't seem to be too ill. He doesn't have a fever. He looks pretty well. Until all of a sudden, he is in extreme pain, banging his head against the wall. So Claire, of course, looks further, and she examines him and finds there is a small worm moving under the surface of his eye. So, no, this is not one of Galus's hexes. This is not the product of Diana's imagination. This is a real disease, and this is a real presentation of this disease. We are dealing with Loa Loa worm, or African eye worm. And this is a parasitic worm that is passed to humans by the bite of a deer fly. This deer fly has a very specific breeding area and is only found in certain rainforests of West and Central Africa. So humans get this from the deer fly, and that is the only way you can contract this disease. This particular deer fly bites a human and infects the human. This disease is not spread person to person. There are no other animals that can have it. It is only the deer fly to the human. So this is really only found in specific endemic areas, particularly West Africa. So we know that this patient of Claire's most likely contracted this when he was still living in Africa before he was enslaved and transported to the West Indies. So this deer fly becomes infected when they bite a infected human. So then this deer fly, who has gotten the Loa Loa worm from a human, then passes it to a healthy human. So they bite the human, they deposit the Loa Loa larvae into the wound, and once inside this human host, the larvae grow into adult worms. That takes about 5 months, and they travel throughout the body. These adult worms like to live in the connective tissues, between layers of connective tissue, such as under the skin and the subcutaneous tissue, or between thin layers of tissue that cover muscle, called fascia, and then, of course, right underneath the surface of the eye as well. And then these adult worms produce thousands of microfilariae, which is a tiny, tiny little larva. They create thousands each day, and these tiny little larvae spend most of their time in the lungs of the human, but then migrate out to the bloodstream all over the body. And then this infected person is bitten again by a deer fly. The deer fly takes some of this tiny larva with it, which then evolve into the more mature larval form and then go on to infect another human. So it's just this cycle. So what happens to a person who's infected with the worm? Most patients actually don't have any symptoms. This is more true for people who live in these endemic areas. People who are traveling to West or Central Africa and become infected there are more likely to have symptoms. And what kind of symptoms developed? Well, you get something called calabar swellings. And these are swellings that are tender, a few inches in diameter, found on the arms and the legs, most often in the forearms. And this is a big area of inflammation that is the body's response to the presence of dead worms or the metabolic products of these worms in these areas. And this is very itchy, and you can actually get itching all over the body as a result also. And then these adult worms can be seen moving underneath the surface of the skin and underneath the surface of the eye. And of course, in the eye, this is going to cause itching, pain, light sensitivity. The worm lasts less than a week, often just hours in the eye, and it actually doesn't cause a lot of damage for the most part because it's most of the time remains right under the surface rather than going deep within the eye. But the worm can lodge in places in the body, and you can develop problems like bowel obstruction when it obstructs the intestines, or kidney inflammation, or endocarditis in the heart, arthritis, and then you can actually, in rare cases, get retinopathy or damage to the deep parts of the eye from the worm also. So, what would Claire do? So Claire asks Kalis for brandy and a small knife, and she takes the knife, sterilizes it with the brandy, and makes a small incision in the sclera of the eye, hooks the needle underneath that worm, and pulls it out. So did this cure her patient? No, as it turns out, but it did provide immense relief from that horror of having that painful worm living underneath the surface of his eye. So how do you treat Loa Loa? Well, surgical removal of the worms from the skin or from the eye when it's observed is not going to cure the disease because it is highly, highly unlikely that a person is infected with only one single worm. So treatment now is with a medication that kills both the worm and all of those thousands of tiny, tiny little larvae or microfilaria that are circulating in the body. And this medication actually can have life-threatening complications if it's given to a person who has really high levels of these little larvae all over the body. So in these endemic areas, treatment is actually reserved for those who have significant symptoms, because remember, a lot of people in these endemic areas don't have symptoms. So in endemic areas, treatment is reserved for those who have symptoms, because remember, not everybody in these endemic areas have symptoms, and who also have low levels when tested in the blood of these microfilaria or larvae. So what's the good news? Well, the good news is that the Loa Loa is only passed from infected deer flies to humans in certain areas of the world, particularly in West and Central Africa. And you cannot get it from an infected person. So if you haven't traveled to that region, you're safe. If you do find yourself traveling to that region, there's medication that can be prescribed to prevent infection. And then, of course, precautions can also be made as much as possible to prevent insect bites. Long pants, long sleeve shirts, and avoiding the times of day and circumstances where you're more likely to be bitten. So for those who are not too squeamish and who are interested, on the blog this week, I've posted a link to a YouTube video just about under 3 minutes that shows a doctor in Nigeria removing a worm from an eye, just as we had Claire describe in Voyager. So it's pretty interesting. It's actually the same procedure Claire would have done for the most part, and it's pretty cool to see for those who aren't very squeamish about those things. So if you like what you're hearing, if you like what you're seeing, reach out. We are on Outlander Sci on Twitter, and we're at Outlander Science Club on Facebook. And if you are following along with the Gem of Outlander Voyager read-along, join us on Wednesdays at 9 Eastern or 6 Pacific for the Twitter chat with a bunch of smart and funny fellow fans. That is a really good time. So until next time, when in doubt, ask yourself, what would Claire do? Bye-bye.